Well, we'll now take up this important thing that we said. Out of the three important things, the divine teacher, his relation with the disciple, Arjuna, and the third one was the circumstance. And we have dealt a bit in detail with the circumstance and the event, its importance. And we had also seen what Sri Aurobindo said about Sri Krishna, his identity with him. His identity was so full that in one of the letters he would write, if you reach Krishna, you reach the divine. If you can give yourself to him, you give yourself to me. So you can see these were some of the letters, and from these we know the completeness of the oneness between Sri Krishna and Sri Aurobindo. But as I said, I will take up in this session not the divine teacher as such, because we should cover one by one the different aspects of this Lord Krishna. And what I suppose is most relevant to us now, not relevant in the sense very important as much, before we take up the one who really gives us the Gita, that who was this personality? Because I'm taking all this, of course, from the chapter only, but I'm not going line by line, I'm taking the main concepts. Because there's one question about the historical Krishna. Because there are questions, while in India we have even the birthday of Sri Krishna, we have the Janmashtami. It is questioned, did Sri Krishna really exist? Or is he a mythological figure? Because as we said, we have so many interpretations and strengths of thought in India that anything and everything is possible here. Some may consider him just a mythological figure, a symbolic figure, a kind of a spiritual figure, and questioning his historical reality. And very interestingly, Sri Aurobindo himself takes up this question in this same chapter, chapter 2, and it is on page 12 and 13 that Sri Aurobindo first takes up, did Sri Krishna really live? And straight away the sentence is, the historical Krishna no doubt existed. And to give arguments to his answer, to his statement, he would say, we meet the name first in the Chandogya Upanishad, where all we can gather about him is that he was well known in spiritual tradition as a knower of the Brahman, so well known indeed in his personality and the circumstances of his life, that it was sufficient to refer to him by the name of his mother as Krishna, son of Devaki, for all to understand who was meant. So you can see now the Chandogya Upanishads, which comes before the Bhagavad Gita, there is a reference to Krishna, son of Devaki. And this is interesting to see. He is known as Krishna, the son of Devaki, the mother, not as it has come to be known these days, son of so and so, we take the father's name. But here he was known as the son of Devaki, the mother. And just that reference was sufficient for people to know who was this Krishna. So that is one historical proof. You see, what Sri Aurobindo is telling us is not his faith or his experience, that is one thing. But just to go by on scholarship and historicity, he gives the first proof we have is in the Chandogya Upanishad. And in the same Upanishad, we find mention of King Dhritarashtra, son of Vichitravirya, and since tradition associated the two together so closely that they are both of them leading personages in the action of the Mahabharata, we may fairly conclude that they were actually contemporaries and that the epic is to a great extent dealing with historical characters, and in the war of Kurukshetra with a historical occurrence imprinted firmly on the memory of the race. That is the first proof, Chandogya Upanishad having names both of Dhritarashtra and Sri Krishna. Secondly, we know too that Krishna and Arjuna were the object of religious worship in the pre-Christian centuries. And there is some reason to suppose that they were so in connection with the religious and philosophical tradition from which the Gita may have gathered many of its elements and even the foundation of its synthesis of knowledge, devotion and works. And perhaps also that the human Krishna was the founder, restorer, or at the least one of the early teachers of this school. That's what I refer to as the Bhagavata religion. So Sri Krishna himself was the founder or restorer or one of the early teachers of this Bhagavata religion, which had this emphasis on the synthesis of knowledge, works and devotion. And this was there already pre-existent. This is the second proof. And then we have in the Mahabharata, Krishna is represented both as the historical character and the avatar. His worship and avatarhood must therefore have been well established by the time, apparently from the 5th to the 1st centuries BC. This is again a very important hint we get regarding the time of the Bhagavad Gita. He says between the 5th and the 1st century BC, Sri Krishna was well established as an avatar. His worship and avatarhood must therefore have been well established by the time when the old story and poem or epic tradition of the Bharatas took its present form. So you see, before even Mahabharata took place, the Kurukshetra and the whole story of Mahabharata, Sri Krishna was an established person as an avatar. So that is why in the Mahabharata itself, he is not just a king and a warrior and a leader, but also some people accepted him as the avatar. So this is interesting that we have both the concepts given to us in the grand epic. There is a hint also in the poem of the story or legend of the avatar's early life in Vrindavan, which as developed by the Puranas into an intense and powerful spiritual symbol, has exercised so profound an influence on the religious mind of India. We have also in the Harivamsha an account of the life of Krishna, very evidently full of legends, which perhaps form the basis of the Puranic accounts. So we have basically these three historic proofs for the historical Krishna. The Chandogya Upanishad, then the religion of Bhagavata religion, then we have in the Mahabharata itself, Krishna, the human figure, Krishna, the avatar. Well, having said this about the historical figure, now we go to the next step as to what was the work done by this historical Krishna. Please remember, not the avatar Krishna. The avatar Krishna will take up later. Because is it that he came to give us a spiritual message, to establish a new law as it is said? But what is that new law? A new dharma, we said. He says, I come from age to age to establish a new dharma. Well, one would be seen as an evolutionary step in consciousness, from the mental consciousness to an over-mental consciousness. But I'm sure people of that time did not understand what the over-mental consciousness was. So we cannot perhaps superimpose saying that Sri Krishna came at that time to bring in the overmind. On the spiritual level he did. But a new dharma that he wanted to establish was also in the socio-political field. That is of great importance. You see, every avatar comes to effectuate himself also on the social, political life of the country, of the human life. And we see that happening in Sri Aurobindo, we see that happening in Sri Ram. So similarly, we have in Sri Krishna also. Well, in Sri Ram it is a little more evident, the way he brought in the new law, new reign, the way he went to the forests and killed the asuras and came back. And just yesterday I was reading something from the bulletin, an answer from Sri Aurobindo. Somebody had asked him about Ram and Ravana. That Ravana, what is said in the stories, was aware that he wanted to get the death in the hands of the avatar Sri Ram. That's what has been said. But Sri Aurobindo says, no, that was not the case. He was not fully consciously conscious of this mission, that he wanted to die at the hands of Rama. But at the same time, Sri Aurobindo would say Ravana was conscious of the truth. That the truth, perhaps, he doesn't explain, but the truth that there is going to be the descent of the divine, and then that divine is coming for some kind of a transformation or the killing of the asuras. And so Ravana consciously gathers in himself all the asuras, so that when he is killed by Sri Ram, he does this great service to humanity, that all the asura consciousness is killed at one go. So that was the conscious Ravana within, not what we have said. Of course, in our own symbology, we do mean some such thing. But Sri Aurobindo reveals that Ravana consciously caught and got into himself all the asuras. And at the same time, you can see this, all the asuras are represented in our Ramayana story by the different sons, by the different warriors in Sri Lanka. And each one of them is a tremendous warrior, and each one of them is a great power in himself. But all these are symbolic representations of the asuras within Ravana. And the very fact of his 10 heads, that tells us the different asuras that were housed in Ravana. So that when Sri Ram beheads Ravan and kills him, in fact, there is some recent modern attempt to make Ravan as the hero of Ramayana. No doubt, if this is the inner truth that Sri Aurobindo reveals, Ravan also plays a great role in the evolution of mankind. So you see, Ravana must have had great guts, great courage, great strength, great tapasya, in order to hold the asuras together and those 10 heads together and then offer them at the feet of the Lord. So how much are we benefited by that? So all the stories of, Sita being taken away and all that, that is also symbolic. He purposely takes away Sita so that the Lord comes in search of her, comes to his den, the den where he is keeping all these asuras. Otherwise, why should Sri Ram go to Ravana? There is no chance. But in order to attract him, he takes away Sita. And who is Sita? She is the very strength, the Shakti of Sri Ram. So first it is Sita who goes into the den, the darkness of Ravana, and there she brings in the light. And then when the avatar follows, he on the physical level, he kills Ravana. So you see, it is a great symbology is there. So it's not just we have a great story of Ramayana and Mahabharata. All of them are imbued with this inner significance, which is now being revealed by Sri Aurobindo here and there. Well, in that context, we see here Sri Krishna also establishes something on the physical level, on the socio-political life. You see, we have always thought of Sri Krishna as one avatar, as the deliverer of the truth of the Bhagavad Gita. But we have not questioned what did he do in his lifetime, except for those few moments of the Bhagavad Gita. He was a great warrior. But Sri Aurobindo brings in a wonderful new explanation of the role of Sri Krishna as a great statesman. And not just as a king. King he was, very powerful. He had a wonderful army, most powerful army of that time, which he gives away to the Kauravas, as all of us know. But what did he achieve? And the fact is very close to Sri Aurobindo's own life. I mean, this analysis that I'm going to read out to you in brief is extremely close to Sri Aurobindo's own work. And now we can understand, perhaps I'm only telling you in advance, why Sri Aurobindo says, I'm continuing Sri Krishna's work in this birth. In what way? You see, on the spiritual level, I'm not tackling at all. It's purely as historical figures. Now, explaining that, Sri Aurobindo tells us that there are always present in human life its 5 principal supports: the individual, the family, the clan, the nation, and the human collectivity. The ideal of human unity. You see, these were the 5 steps. He says that is the evolutionary plan of human society. Now, the individual and the family, of course, is pretty much prehistoric, in the sense it is every society, every culture, every nation goes through the importance of the individual and the family. In fact, he would trace it right to the times of very early times of civilization, that first the individual is important. He is in his ego, he is kind of closed in his own individual development, and then when he has the family, there is a higher level of the ego. When his ego enlarges, he becomes more open and broad because he thinks of the others. The individual, however great he may be, not in spiritually but on the mundane level, he concentrates on himself, his success, his work, his business, his property, his comforts, etc. But the use of the family comes in at this juncture when the individual can enlarge himself to his wife and children and family, taking care of that. When he forgets about himself, the I is no more important, the we of the family becomes important. So the individual ego identifies as the family ego. That is the general normal process of the individual's evolution. So when we say in this human society, normally people are young, they become marriageable age, they get married and they have children. It's a normal process of nature itself. You see, this marriage, etc., may have been institutionalized, but it has a role in the expansion of the individual ego, which otherwise is egocentric, individual-centric. So, society has adapted, every culture has adapted the question of the family. Now, we are not discussing that. We are coming into the level of the clan. Now, Sri Krishna, his main aim is, even at that time, because you see, at that time all the clans were well established. There were dozens of great clans, including the Kuru clan, Panchala clan, and all of them. So India was known by its clans. Clans means the little kingdom that were there. So India was strewn with these multiple clans or multiple small kingdoms. There was no nation. But there was a common culture, a common language of Sanskrit, and common traditions, common suffering. But the nation as a unit was not there at that time. And this, in brief, is the attempt the very first attempt in Indian history to bring about a nation is made by Sri Krishna. That is the sum and substance of what I'm going to read out now. That he tried to bring about the next step in evolution. That means individual, family and clan were achieved in Bharat Desh. No, it was not even a Desh, it was only Bharat. But then the next step in the evolutionary march was the birth of the nation. And Sri Krishna was the first one to try to make India into a nation, and which succeeded or failed. For a short while it succeeded, but later again it got split into all those so-called kingdoms that we have had. And it was nature again which brought back Britishers to make India into a nation. So you see, there is a grand scheme in nature, grand scheme in the divine's mind. He may use any way and every way to progress, to march forward. So India never existed as a country, and Sri Krishna was the first one to make that attempt. So here is Sri Aurobindo's argument. He says, to establish such a unity, empire or rule of law was Sri Krishna's political objective. So let's not think he was just a king for the sake of being a king or a great king. He had no ambitions of a king, of being a great king. The ambition was how to bring about this nation. And it is because of this great objective that he plans Kurukshetra. So if anyone is to be held responsible for Kurukshetra, it is Sri Krishna himself. It is not Duryodhan, it is not Dhritarashtra, it is not the Pandavas. They were all, what we say, players in the game. But the real master of the game was Sri Krishna, who was trying to pull all of them into one battlefield. Why? We will see. The Magadhan king Jarasandha had already made this attempt to make one nation, remember, at his time. But his power was founded on tyranny, and unrighteousness would therefore be short-lived. Hence Sri Krishna baffled that attempt by getting him killed at the hands of Bhima. You see, now we get so much of new interpretation. Otherwise we have, on the movies and films. But behind that is the plan of Sri Krishna, that Jarasandha, if he achieves to make a nation, it would be of a tyranny. So he liquidates him. The main obstacle to Sri Krishna's work was the proud and powerful family of the Kurus. So the next thing was to demolish this Kuru clan itself, because that was the most powerful clan, and that clan was the obstruction in Sri Aurobindo's plan to make India into a nation. So he plans the destruction of Kurus. The Kuru people had for a long time been among the leading peoples of India to what is called hegemony, that is a position of preeminence and leadership among a number of independent peoples of equal status. To that the Kurus had an ancestral right. As long as the pride and power of this people remained intact, unity would never be established in India. And this the statesman Sri Krishna knew about it. Sri Krishna came to realize this. Therefore, he was determined to destroy the Kuru people. But the Kuru people had a hereditary right to the empire of India. Sri Krishna did not forget this fact. To deprive one of his rightful due would be an act of unrighteousness. So he chose for appointment to the future position of Emperor Yudhishthira, who was legally the king and chief of the Kuru people. Sri Krishna was supremely righteous. So you see how Sri Aurobindo is giving us an inside view, an insight in, I must say, into Sri Krishna's work. So right from the beginning, Sri Krishna's motive was how to destroy the Kurus. And to destroy the Kurus, The most important thing was to break them into two, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, because together they would be formidable. So the best way was to break them into two groups and put them to fight each other, because no other clan could fight the Kurus. So the best thing was divide and rule, the same policy that we had later. So he breaks them into into two groups. But Sri Krishna is also known to be, as people say, he is very unrighteous. But Sri Aurobindo says, Sri Krishna was supremely righteous. He did not, out of affection, attempt to set up his beloved clan of the Yadavas in place of the Kuru people, even though capable of doing it. Understand this with an extremely beautiful point. Yadava clan was a great clan, and the king himself was very powerful. If he wanted, he could have dethroned the Kurus and put his clan. But he was righteous. So he doesn't even put Arjuna in the place of Yudhishthir. Although Arjuna was more beloved to him, he says no. Yudhishthir is legally the eldest and rightfully the king of the Kurus. So Sri Aurobindo is telling us how Sri Krishna planned all these things right from the beginning. So all those incidents of Pandavas suffering, etc., they are very good stories. But now if you know the inner meaning, even these stories become much more relevant and really symbolic. So he says, he did not nominate for that position his dearest friend Arjuna by ignoring the eldest born of the Pandavas, Yudhishthira. But this is possibility of harm in considering only the age or previous title. If Yudhishthir had been unrighteous, tyrannical or incapable, Sri Krishna would have been obliged to look for another candidate. Yudhishthir was as well fitted to be emperor by birth, rightful title, and the old established tradition of the land, as he was the proper claimant to that title by virtue of his qualities. There were many great and heroic kings more powerful and talented than him. Please remember this is very important. There were many great and heroic kings more powerful and talented than him, but strength and talent alone do not give one a title to kingship. The king was to safeguard the rule of law, number 1. 2, keep the subjects contented. 3, protect the land. And Sri Aurobindo says, in the first 2 of these qualities, Yudhishthir had no peer. That means, to safeguard the rule of law, he was also known, other name of Yudhishthir is Dharmaraj, king of law, maintaining that law. So there was nobody who could compare with him. And then the question of keeping the subjects contented. Obviously he was loved by his people. But the one weak point about Yudhishthir was the third one, that he could not protect the land by himself. But Sri Krishna saw to it that he was strengthened in this effort by his own brothers, Bhim and Arjun, who were the great warriors who could protect the land. So Sri Krishna finds in Pandavas, in this combination of Yudhishthir, Bhim and Arjun, all the qualities required for an emperor who could really come into this and rule the place. So he says, Yudhishthir had no peer. He was a son of the Lord of righteousness after all. Who was the Lord of righteousness? Who is the other person known as Dharmaraj? Yama. Yama Dharmaraj. So he is the son of Yama. And so he is one who retains Dharma. And what a strange combination that Yama is one who maintains law and Dharma. Try to see this in Savitri. That is why he doesn't allow Savitri to break the Dharma that no dead man can come back. And Savitri in Mahabharata, not in Sri Aurobindo Savitri, is very clever. When she is asking for her boons, she says, I want 100 children for her own father, Ashwapati. And Yama says, no problem. She says, I want eyesight for my father-in-law. He says, no problem, you can have that. Then she says, I want my own children, 100 children. Then Yama says, no problem. And then she says, how can I have 100 children without Satyavan? And then she says, you are Dharmaraj. You have to maintain and you have to help me to maintain the dharma of the Grihastha ashrama. So how can you ask me to be a cheat? I can't have children with somebody else. So she attacks him on his own principle that he is the maintainer of law and dharma. That is why he is known as Dharmaraj, and then when he is trapped on his own dharma, he says, yes, I agree. So Savitri is back. And Satyavan is given back. But in Sri Aurobindo too, it is the same law and rule. It is not the question of children, we don't see that. But we have the same way where death says that I am the gateway to immortality. Remember. And death will not allow any kind of falsehood and ignorance to go beyond the gates into immortality unless you purify yourself. So even in Savitri, Sri Aurobindo's Savitri, death is playing the same role. It is the gateway to immortality. Unless you find your psychic being, unless you find that Satchidananda consciousness, you do not have the pass to go into immortality. And I am the keeper of immortality. I will not let you go. So the role is same. One is in the form of story and mythology, but the truth is the same that is caught in Sri Aurobindo Savitri too. So this Yama's role is an incredible role. And I was telling him in a class last time that recently I heard in South India there is going to be a temple for Yamadharmaraj. But the first time we hear that, a temple for Yama. And there also the priest said it is not the question of asking for give me extra like 25 years or make me 50 years more. No. That is the law. He will not give you extra life. An extra life, an extension of life will be given one who is beyond Yama Dharmaraj. And that's what the Mother and Sri Aurobindo did to many a sadhak in the ashram. I will not quote names. Extended their lives by 25 years, extended somebody's life by this. I myself spoken to the person who said, my life has been extended, and the mother told him, I have extended your life for the work. So she could do that because she is beyond death. So, but Yama himself, left to himself, he'll say, I cannot recommend. Somebody beyond me, let her do what she wants, but in my purview, I cannot. So also, that same Yamadharmaraj, the child of Yamadharmaraj is Yudhishthira. So that is why he is such a keeper of law. He spoke the truth. He was kind and just. He kept up the truth. So Yudhishthira was a perfect person for becoming the king. The deficiency he had, of course, as I explained, it was covered by Bhim and Arjun. And therefore, contemporary India did not possess kings as powerful or men as heroic as the 5 Pandavas. Therefore, once the obstacle was removed by the killing of Jarasandha, King Yudhishthira, on the advice of Sri Krishna, performed the Rajasuya sacrifice in accordance with the ancient tradition of the land and became its emperor. So, the first object, to make India into one empire, one nation. That Sri Krishna achieved. Then Sri Aurobindo writes, Sri Krishna was a follower of the right law and a master of the science of politics. I'm reading out these, but keep in mind, most of you know here, Sri Aurobindo's own life. I'll draw a parallel later, but I'm giving you a hint at this stage. If there was a possibility of carrying to fruition his great objective by working within the framework of the law of the land, its tradition, the rules of its society, then why should you deviate from that law, go against that tradition, break those rules? To bring about such revolutions in politics and society is harmful to the country. For this reason, he at first directed his attempts to gain his objective by maintaining the ancient tradition. But there was this defect in the ancient tradition of the land that even if the attempts made in accordance with it were successful, there was very little chance of the success being permanent. Well, of course, I'll cut short the reading to tell you that Sri Krishna was a great master of the science of politics. Well, in what we say modern terms, politician or statesman. Now, in the beginning, he tried to bring in a kind of a higher law, this nationhood, trying to see if any one clan could be put into place. But then, as a shrewd politician, he knew that today, if I put the Kurus in place, Yudhishthira may be accepted as an emperor. But then, after 3 generations, the clan would become weaker perhaps, and then the whole thing would break apart. So then he decided that it is no use keeping one clan as the ruler of the Indian empire. So shrewdly he says, he brings in this master politician, as Sri Aurobindo says, a master of political science, as he was righteous. He says he was the principal revolutionist of the age. That's something new. So Sri Krishna was a great revolutionary. We see its reflections in Sri Aurobindo's own political life. That he was the first one to call upon the nation of the country of India. Sri Aurobindo in his Bande Mataram along with Bipin Chandra, they were the first one to call upon the nation to bring about the nationhood. Otherwise, the Britishers were dividing India, and the Congress at that time was really so weak, it did not have the vision of the whole country. They were ready to serve the Britishers for a little bit of chips here and there. But like Sri Aurobindo and like Sri Krishna, Sri Aurobindo was the first one once again to bring in the nationhood into our country. Well, as we go, again, just as Sri Krishna was a great revolutionist of the age, Sri Aurobindo was the first revolutionary. In fact, the revolutionaries in Bengal were first formed by Sri Aurobindo, the group of the revolutionaries. So you see the commonalities on even the outer field, the outer life itself. Then Sri Aurobindo writes, Sri Krishna realized on Yudhishthira's downfall, not realized but knew from the beginning, for he was God, that a custom suited to the Dwapara epoch should never be preserved in the Kali age. This is very relevant for our own times, please see that. Therefore, he made no further attempts on those lines. That means, on those lines means to put Yudhishthira as the king. Just, he could have avoided all the war and everything, put Yudhishthira as the king. But as I said, if Yudhishthira became a king just per se, then the clan would have fought itself, or it would have become weak, and then India would have lost the emperor. So he says the law of the Kali Yuga is different. What is that? He made no further attempts on those lines. He followed the line of statecraft proper to Kali, with its emphasis on war and strife, and directed his efforts towards making the future of empire free of obstacles by destroying the power of the insolent and proud Kshatriya race. This is something we never knew about. He says we have to break the backbone of the Kshatriyahood, otherwise all these clans would again clamor for division. He incited the Panchala people, ancient and equally powerful rivals of the Kurus, to destroy the latter. All the other peoples who could be attracted out of hatred towards the Kurus for the love of Yudhishthira or out of desire for unity and the rule of law were attracted to that side, and he got the preliminaries of war made ready. In the attempts that were made towards peace, Sri Krishna had no faith. Please remember, Sri Krishna went as a peacemaker. He was selected. Bhishma asked him. But he knew his attempt would fail. Something rings in your mind. The same attempt, the Cripps proposal. Sri Aurobindo knew Cripps' proposal would fail, but he was the peacemaker at the time. He does send the message through somebody personally from Pondicherry to Delhi. He knew very well the government of the country at that time, the leaders of Congress would not accept. He had no faith in it, but still he says, in the law of this eternal spiritual forces, the act must be done, even though you know its failure. So did Sri Krishna. He knew that peace was not possible. Even if it were made, it could not last. Still, out of regard for the right law and from considerations of policy, he devoted himself to attempts at peace. You see, the avatar also goes with the times. He knows, but he acts to the consciousness of the people of the time. There is no doubt that Kurukshetra war was the result of Sri Krishna's policy, and that to destroy the Kurus, to destroy the power of Kshatriyas, to establish an undisputed imperial authority and the unity of India were his objectives. So this was the great war. The war that was fought in order to establish the rule of law was a righteous war. The God-appointed victor in that righteous war was the mighty warrior Arjuna, driven by a divine power. If Arjuna were to give up his arms, Sri Krishna's labors would have come to naught. The unity of India could not be achieved. A great evil would soon have overtaken the future of the land. So you see, the avatar, the statesman, the master of political science, why he chose Arjuna, why he prepared him to be the great warrior. And to prepare him to be the great warrior, he had to take him through all those problems of the Pandavas. Otherwise, Arjuna wouldn't have come out to be such a great warrior. He was, even as a student, the greatest archer, no doubt about it. But to get a first class in MA or PhD is not sufficient. You have got to put your talent in the life situation. So all the wars that were fought by Pandavas against against Dhritarashtra and Duryodhana were a kind of a training ground where Arjuna gains his experience of a warrior. Because Sri Krishna knew what Sri Aurobindo writes here, if Arjuna were to give up his arms, Sri Krishna's labors would have come to naught. Therefore, once again, the necessity of the Bhagavad Gita to convince Arjuna to take away his illusion and to take up the war. Because Sri Krishna had worked toward this point, this circumstance, wherein so much relied upon his own friend and disciple. So he says, and Sri Aurobindo writes, the unity of India would not be achieved, a great evil would soon have overtaken the future of the land. And then further he says, if Arjuna gave up his arms, it would be a victory for unrighteousness. Duryodhana would become the paramount king of India and the leading man in the whole country. He would, by his bad example, put a strain on the national character and the code of behavior of Kshatriya families. The strong and mighty Indian clans would turn to each other's destruction under the impulse of jealousy, self-interest and love of antagonism. There would be no undisputed state power guided by the rule of law to unify, govern and keep the country well defended by a concentration of power. Under such conditions, that foreign invasion, which even at that time was preparing like a sea held by the dikes to come upon India and inundate it, would, arriving before its time, have destroyed the Aryan civilization and rooted out all hopes of the future good of the world. You see Sri Aurobindo's reading of the Gita. We are still, you see, although we are speaking about Sri Krishna the statesman, we can see the importance of the circumstance. Why Sri Krishna took so much trouble to explain about the Gita to Arjuna? Because he was the pin of his hope. And if he did not fight, all his plans would come to a naught and almost his own avatarhood on the material, physical life level would have come to a kind of a nullification. And therefore, this person, Arjuna, who was on the level of the religion and ethics and morality, and was also influenced by his own times of asceticism, which we'll discuss at greater length in the next chapter. You see, Sri Aurobindo analyzes in the Life Divine we are discussing recently in our class, the human being, a normal human being, goes through 4 stages of evolution in his own inner consciousness. In the beginning, he gets this idea of sin, of virtue, of morality, of what is good and bad on the individual level. When I am a young man, I accept what is good for me. What is not good for me, I reject. It may be in the form of parents or teachers or adults or elders or anything. Because he is only individualistic. Each one of us has been that. At a particular point when we call the teenagers or whatever, we are terribly individualistic. So we reject the family. And there is this tension between what we call the generation gap. But that is the natural, normal law of life. And then this sense of sin and virtue, good and bad, Sri Aurobindo says, it takes the second level of the social pattern. When the individual joins an association, be it a company, be it a factory, be it a union, be it anything, he immediately becomes a kind of a social member. And then his priorities change. You see, he gets married, he has children, he has family. So the individual ego turns into the social ego, and then his own interpretation, his own preferences they change. Because now he is looking for the association to survive. He is ready to sacrifice himself for the sake of the group, the association, the club, whatever it is. This is the sense of good and wrong and sin and virtue that the individual has got at the second level. Then he says the individual moves on to the third level, wherein he strongly takes up religion, ethics, morality, some yoga. A lot of people we have seen in the West and East, at this level of their growth, they become members of some yoga, some ashram, some system, whatever you call. You may go to some acharya, you may go to some master, but this is the tendency in the individual's life. He turns to religion, ethics and morality, which he finds in the name of a guru, in the name of a school, in the name of an ashram, in the name of this, whatever. But most of the people, they get stuck here. Because there they find some sense of an achievement that I belong to Hare Krishna movement. I got a label here, I got ochre clothes, I got a mala here, and I think I become somebody. So the sense of the individuality of achievement comes in when you say, oh, I am a member of the Sri Aurobindo ashram, I am a member of the Ramakrishna ashram. So that once the label is on you, you feel I have arrived at something. I become a spiritual person. So there is a kind of a false label on our forehead that you are so and so religionist. So you become fanatic at that time. Why is that young people are not so fanatic? Because they are not thinking of the religion and the ethics, they are thinking about themselves. So that's why they are leaders in the universities, they go on the campus, they have all this. Because the individual is important, not the religion at that time, not ethics and morality. They throw to wind all morality. Because that's not the stage. So naturally, Sri Aurobindo would say, is at the third level. Of course, there are these individuals who get brainwashed and who become fanatics. But however, in the natural growth, the third level is the level of religion. There, most people get stuck. It is very few who go to the fourth level, that of the psychic, the soul discrimination, or that of the spirituality. Just yesterday, we have all got the message of spirituality. What is true spirituality? I mean, all of you have read that message. Now you know what we mean by the fourth level. Not all the other things are only a preparation, says Sri Aurobindo. All the other levels are a preparation to come to this fourth level, but as is the human tendency and mentality, we get stuck at the preparation level itself. Because either we are exhausted, we are stuck, our egos get satisfaction. So that is the level. And this is exactly where Arjuna was at this stage when Kurukshetra starts. He was stuck at the ethical level. And he had this great pride of belonging to the Kuru family. He had this pride, as I said, to belong to somebody was your achievement. So he belonged to the Pandavas, the great Kurus, and that great clan. So, and then he was the defender. He knew himself to be the greatest warrior. And Sri Krishna sees that unless and until I break this mentality in him, his own plan will not succeed. And therefore, he takes him in front of Bhishma and Drona and says, see and look at the Kuru family which you have to destroy. So you see, a message goes into his mind. Arjuna doesn't catch it, but slowly it gets revealed to him. Suddenly that weakness erupts in him and says, my God, this is the clan for which I have been living and dying that I have to now kill. So his great what is that called? Dhanus is put on the ground. So you see, Sri Krishna works out, and Sri Krishna patiently, now what is Gita? It is just transferring the individual from this religio-ethical stage to the spiritual. That is the wonderful psychological transfer. You see, if all of us, each one of us, when we read the Gita and try to practice, this is an occasion for us to transfer ourselves from this third level where we are stuck up emotionally, traditionally, culturally, mentally. And then the Lord says, no, go to the fourth level. Fourth level is the spiritual level, where I am your guide, where I take up the responsibility, where you are not the doer, I am the doer. So you see, it's an extraordinarily beautiful psychological work. So this is the message given to the general humanity. Whereas we are making a cult out of Gita itself. We are getting stuck in the Gita itself. It is not the question of, when he says, Sarva Dharman Parityaja, we have all had our interpretations. But Sri Krishna says, abandon those dharmas in which you are all stuck up. Sarva Dharman Parityaja. So all these dharmas of, my class and my clan and my nation and my this and this, and my religion, my ethics and good. He says all these dharmas only bind you. Parityaja, sacrifice them. Then Mamekam Sharanam Vraja. What Sri Aurobindo said yesterday in the message, when you go to the psychic being and surrender yourself to that psychic being and be guided by that, then you become spiritual. Not by all the bhakti songs you have, all the meditations you have, all the preparations. So Gita is that wonderful scripture, teaching, advice, call it what you want, but to help humanity to move to that fourth level. And obviously now the Bhagavad Gita becomes so very important because Sri Aurobindo is bringing in the spiritual age. Now you see the relevance. Sri Aurobindo is speaking about the new age that is coming, that is already on the horizon, that has already started coming in. The mother declares, the new world is born, 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 born. 4 times she repeats. So if the new world is born, how are we to go into the new world? So Gita Sri Aurobindo uses to transfer this age into the next coming age, of which he is the herald, he is the gateway, he is the path, he is the strength. But then he says Gita on the mass level is the best force to push you forward. So he took all the pains of writing this essays on the Gita. Now you can understand. Otherwise, why should he have written this? But he releases a new force in the Gita so that the man stuck on the religio-ethical level moves to the spiritual level. And coming back, there's one line which I would like to draw your attention to. He says, if Arjuna had not fought this war and Duryodhana had come, it would have been a great unrighteousness. And then the danger is that under such condition, that foreign invasion would, arriving before its time, have destroyed the Aryan civilization. So you see, as a statesman, what he does, it was imperative to have India as one empire. Otherwise, the Romans were there on your border. They would have, as it says, as a sea held by dikes. So the foreign invasion would have come even in those early times of the Gita, which came after 1,000 years with the Muslims. But Sri Krishna, in a way, holds that foreign invasion for almost 1,000 years thanks to his plans. It's only when this philosophy of negativism came, when the philosophy of asceticism came, when Buddhism and Shankara prevailed, India lost its Kshatriya hood, that the foreign invasion came. And till now, we are suffering the same foreign invasion. We are in the same mentality of bringing the foreigners to our help, to rule our country, to rule our policies, to dictate our policies. That's because Sri Aurobindo says we have lost our Kshatriya hood. And therefore Sri Aurobindo's fight for the national freedom is again relevant, you see. Unless India becomes once again a one country, a one nation, it cannot stop the foreign invasions. So what Sri Krishna stopped, Sri Aurobindo rejected the Britishers in order to see that India gets back its own Kshatriya hood. And then the last para, they say that the ills for fear of which Arjuna had raised those objections did actually come as a result of the Kurukshetra war. Fratricide, the ruin of clans, even the ruin of the peoples were the fruits of the Kurukshetra war. This war was the occasion for the onset of Kali. It is true, this war led to a terrible fratricide. The question arises, by what other means could the great objectives of Sri Krishna be met? Precisely for this reason did Sri Krishna, knowing well the futility of seeking the peace, make considerable attempts to find a way to peace. Yudhishthira would have desisted from war had he got back even the 5 villages. If he could secure even that much space as a foothold, Sri Krishna could have established the rule of law. You see, poor Sri Krishna, he tried to avoid what Yudhishthira says, give me 5 villages. And that was enough for Sri Krishna as a foothold to establish his new dharma. But when the opponents even deny that even a foothold, what would you do? So Sri Krishna is almost left without any choice. Because there have been some critics to say, why was this great Kurukshetra killing so many of Kshatriyas, so many of our people and all that? But Sri Aurobindo is saying, there couldn't have been a better choice. The good of the family had to be submerged in the good of the nation, the good of the world. This is of primary importance, that the family has to be sacrificed for the sake of the nation, and the nation sacrificed for the sake of the world. So at the time, clan was important. So Sri Krishna says, sacrifice the clan, because the next oncoming evolutionary step is the nation. So what Sri Aurobindo tells us in Ideal of Human Unity, Sri Krishna had foreseen at that time. The evolutionary march is to nation. And today Sri Aurobindo says, the next step is the world unity. Those 5 dreams that all of you know. So you see how Sri Aurobindo is continuing the work of Sri Krishna is in this manner. Sri Krishna brought about the nation, Sri Aurobindo is bringing about the human unity. So it is but a next stage in the evolutionary march of nature towards a greater aggregate of humanity. So what we are discussing is purely practical, pragmatic level that is to be achieved by humanity. So Sri Krishna takes the liberty of destroying the clans to bring about, to hasten nationhood. And then we had in our own time, not in our time, but in many people have seen that, the coming of the two wars, the world wars. What was that? Another Kurukshetra. Sri Aurobindo did not stop the coming of the Kurukshetras or the world wars, first and the second war. Why? It's the same philosophy, the same policy. Sacrifice the nation for the birth of the next evolutionary step, the world unity. So Kurukshetra is inevitable. What Sri Krishna did was inevitable, and what Sri Aurobindo gave credence to, permitted almost, and took even sides in the war of the first world war and the second war, was exactly like Sri Krishna, that this old nation ego must be broken and destroyed so that the new world unity may come about. And all of us know that for the first time the nations thought about a League of Nations, thought about the United Nations organizations, because their ego of nations was broken down. But how much is successful? How much man has gone back to the nationhood? How much we have become selfish nations once again? Well, it's for all of us to see. So that is why Sri Aurobindo brings in the second step, thus continuing the work that Sri Krishna had done. Well, in fact, Sri Aurobindo himself writes this, not openly about himself, but we can see what he means. He writes that in this age, the nation is the foundation of the law, the pivot of human society. Prior to that, clan. Today, when Sri Aurobindo came, it was nation. To preserve the nation is the primary duty of this age. To cause the ruin of the nation, the great unforgivable sin. We should not, but first make a nation. Before you break it, first make it. And that's what Sri Aurobindo had to do. We didn't have a nation. So Sri Aurobindo fought the Britishers so that there's the birth of Indian nation. But Sri Aurobindo, in 1910, he came away to Pondicherry even before the nation was made. But he knew the nation is in the making. He knew already the signs of the new sunrise of the Indians' independence. He comes away because he had to do the next step in evolution. He had to work for the next step in evolution, that is to bring the human unity. So his withdrawal to Pondicherry was not accidental, was not a withdrawal because, as people say, because there was a warning on him that he will be arrested again, so he ran away, took shelter in Pondicherry. No, there's a wrong reading. He did not take shelter in Pondicherry. The inner meaning was that from the nation to the world unity, he had to move on. That is the new dharma that Sri Krishna himself tells him. So he says, to preserve the nation is the primary duty of this age. To cause the ruin of the nation, the great unforgivable sin. But, the last sentence, there can possibly be the advent of an age when a great society of the nations can be established. Society of the nations means human unity. At that time, perhaps the world's eminent men of knowledge and action would take up arms in defense of the nation, and the other side, Sri Krishna, as a maker of revolutions, would start a new Kurukshetra war and effect the good of the world. And who is this Sri Krishna once again, who came back to effect the good of the world, to bring in the new evolutionary march? We don't have to pronounce it. It is much too obvious. Sri Aurobindo himself. So here we see, friends, the wonderful link when Sri Aurobindo said that I am identified with Sri Krishna. On what levels they have been identified? write as personalities, historic personalities, the work that they have done for the nation, the society, the country, as well as on the spiritual march. So this is now why essays on the Gita was so very important for Sri Aurobindo, and why the occasion was most important for the essays for the Bhagavad Gita. More than the Lord saying, the occasion becomes so very important, because this Lord Sri Krishna's entire work depended on that occasion. So it is not to establish the dharma on the spiritual levels alone. It had a political, social repercussions. And that was the work for which Sri Krishna was born as a historical figure, and then who later became a Sri Krishna on different levels. So having said all this, don't think I have not covered chapter 2. I have covered almost 3/4 or 50% of the chapter 2. I have taken all the major ideas, but still tomorrow I will take up chapter 2 and I will take up the missing ideas, because there are 2 or 3 more important ideas there. Because this will be more or less the pattern of our study. I will not go sentence by sentence of the chapter, but as I do normally, give you the main arguments, lines of thought, and expand some of these thoughts in the light of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother's own explanations.